America has always been a nation of immigrants. Every person in America, unless you're a Native American, came here at some point. And even those Native Americans at some point crossed the Bering Strait and crossed over into North America and then throughout North America, Central America, and South America. But when we think of the United States, if you're not a Native American, then you immigrated here, either by your own choice or you were forced to come. And not only just slaves who were forced to come, but think of all the wives that didn't really want to come, that were forced to come with their husband, or the children that had to come with their parents. But everybody in America, unless you're a Native American, immigrated here. So immigration in the United States in the late 1800s and early 1900s is the focus of this talk. And I want you to really consider the impact that immigration will have on the United States, especially during this era. And there will be a pattern of previous immigrants versus new immigrants. Because generally when people come to the United States, once they're here, they don't want anyone else to come. They want all the benefits to themselves. And as a general note, we should realize that when we talk about immigration with an I, that means immigrants that are coming in to the country. And if we talk about immigrants with an E, that means that are people leaving a country, exiting. So I means coming in, and immigrant with an E means we're leaving, exiting. So we're going to really talk about the late 1800s and early 1900s. So from the very beginning, though, the 13 colonies were full of immigrants, people who wanted to come from Europe and those who did not want to come, maybe from Africa, as slaves. But those who came from Europe tended to come from, say, Northern Europe or Western Europe. But by the time we get to the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s, we're going to see a peak in immigration in 1907, but a new wave of immigration. These new immigrants that are going to be coming at the turn of the century will be from other parts of Europe, Southern and Eastern Europe, places like Greece and Russia, Hungary, Italy, Turkey, and Poland. And this will bring some conflict as they arrive and come in contact with immigrants who have arrived earlier from Northern Europe or Western Europe, so those who are from England or Ireland or Germany. But about 80% of the immigrants who will be coming around the turn of the century are going to be from these new parts of Europe. And it's going to lead to just a new flavor and a new feel for the United States. And it will lead to some tension. And it will cause America to kind of grow in ways that was quite unexpected, really, previously in the earlier years. So it's just going to be such a huge boom in immigration. So there'll still be some people coming from the old parts of Europe, but only about 20% will come from the northern and western part. 80% will come from the southern and eastern parts of Europe. And these newcomers, many of them will be of the Catholic faith and the Jewish faith, which will also add to the diversity of the nation. And some of the tension that will come as a result of these new faith groups. There'll be a lot of people who are very wary about Catholics coming to the mostly Protestant nation of the United States. And Jews, when they arrive, will find that there'll be some who resist them as well. This doesn't mean that all the people who come to the United States are from Europe, but a huge chunk are. And when these people come from Europe to the United States, they will arrive mostly in New York. And so we know the Statue of Liberty is a gift from France in 1876 for America's 100th birthday, so you can see that kind of that photo from around that time period. But you can also read part of the poem that is at the base of the Statue of Liberty called the Great Colossus. So you remember from world history, the Colossus was a statue in the Mediterranean And so this new colossus, this new statue, giant statue, was welcoming people to the New World, to the United States. And in this poem, Emma Lazarus writes, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, your wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed," meaning those who have been in the storm. "To me, I lift my lamp beside the golden door." So just as a welcome to all those who are arriving in the New World, into America, from mostly Europe. So this is what it would have looked like in New York Harbor in the early 1900s. You can see the Statue of Liberty there. But once you arrived in the harbor, you would go to a U.S. Government Reception Center at Ellis Island, and that's the most famous one. You can see that with the pink star there. Once you arrived at Ellis Island, if you're a new immigrant in the early 1900s, you would arrive and you would be processed. And you can see from some of these images, obviously you would stand in line, you would be checked over, they would physically make sure you weren't sick or have any kind of diseases. They would process you and ask you where you were from. And these processes weren't always fair or nice, but generally most people made it through and brought with them their culture and their custom and their languages. And just take a moment to kind of soak in some of these images from Ellis Island. You can see that these pictures are real photographs of people arriving from a lot of these southern or eastern countries. Poland, Italy, many of these are Catholics and people of the Jewish faith. These new immigrants bring with them a new faith, and that will lead to a lot of tension, because typically when people would come from, say, England or Scotland or Ireland, Germany, France, they would blend a little bit into American society. But with this new wave of immigrants coming from Eastern and Southern Europe, many of them being Catholic and Jews, blending was difficult. And so they would stick together, they would cluster together in neighborhoods, and it would start to create a little bit of resentment between those who had come earlier. There would always be this tension between those Americans who had immigrated earlier and those who are arriving. And there would be some tension over who, maybe these new immigrants would take our jobs. Maybe they will have better housing than us. They'll have more say. And so it's just a pattern in American history that once people are here, they don't want anyone else to come. And you can kind of see from this image, people having a meal together. And when I still go to large cities today, or when you still go to large cities today, you would see sometimes ethnic neighborhoods like maybe Little Italy, for example, in New York City, where people who have come just kind of stick together. This tension between blending in and assimilating versus being a distinct culture is something that is kind of an interesting tension there at the beginning of the 20th century, because obviously you want to be part of American society, but you also want to hold on to some of your old world ways and maybe even the language. Whereas maybe the parents held on to the language and the children might speak that language at home, but when they're at school or out in public, they probably try to speak English. And many of these, and you can see in their faces, they're optimistic about finding a better life here in America, finding a place to live and to work, and hoping that life here will be far better than what they had back in their mother country. But not all of the people who came to America in the early 1900s and late 1800s were from Europe. Of course, there were lots of immigrants who came to the West Coast, who were from China or Japan. And there were some who came to New York as well, but obviously geographically it's easier to get to California from Asia than it would be all the way to New York. So there were a great number of Chinese and Japanese immigrants who would come to the United States, but they're not going to be processed in Ellis Island in New York. They will go to a government reception center. The famous one that's in San Francisco Harbor is Angel Island, and a vast majority of Chinese and Japanese immigrants would go here to get processed and then become welcome to the United States. And once they are in, they'll try to find housing. And again, the same story. They might live in ethnic groups, work in ethnic groups. And so you might find in, say, San Francisco, Chinatown, where you would find people who still cling to a lot of the cultural aspects of the old world. So life in America promised hard work, probably low pay, dangerous conditions, and there would be sweatshops, whether we're talking about New York or California or Boston. These sweatshops would spring up, but even these difficult working conditions were still better than many of the conditions that the immigrants had back in their mother country, or where they were immigrating from. So, we're talking about times when people who worked were not protected really by the federal government. There were no working conditions, so there were not a lot of safety standards yet. The Department of Labor hasn't really been created to make sure that everybody's working under safe conditions, and you could work really hard for low pay and dangerous conditions, but people were willing to do it in order to make it here in America. And of course, the struggle was, do we assimilate, be part of America, blend in, or do we try to retain our culture and our language and try to kind of be a part? And the answer is both. I think they tried to, these immigrants, by majority of them, did blend in, but yet still retain some of their language and culture, especially at home or in their neighborhoods. And they did build communities in their neighborhoods through newspapers and stores, clubs, restaurants, where they could go and be around people from that same country, but also be part of life in New York or Boston or whatever city. And as I mentioned, not everyone was eager to accept these new people arriving. There was resistance to immigration. In the 1800s, there were nativist movements that resisted it. The political party in the 1850s, the Know Nothing Party, also called the American Party, formed as a result of a good number of Catholics coming to America and people coming from other countries from Europe that most Americans who had come from other countries in Europe, say England, France, Scotland, they did not want people coming, and so they worked to restrict the rights of these immigrants. And also they worked to restrict the amount of immigrants through laws. Like they passed laws that said certain people could not come. And so in 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which said people from China could not come for 10 years. And then 10 years after that, they passed it again. And then 10 years after that, they passed it again. So there's always been this movement to keep or limit the amount of people from China arriving in the United States to a minimum. And in 1908, the United States and Japan agreed on a number of immigrants coming to the United States. We would also, Japan agreed to limit the number of people coming, and we agreed as a nation to treat them well. And then in 1917, Congress passed the Immigration Act, which said that if you were coming to the United States, you had to know how to read or write. In other words, you had to be literate. And also, there were certain parts of the globe that people were prohibited from coming to the United States from. So certain parts of Asia, you could not come to the United States. So there is some history of America kind of not knowing how to handle immigration, or doing it poorly, or having some prejudice with what groups to come. And it seems to be focused quite a bit on people from the Asian region. But there's also been movements to keep people from who are Catholic out. And during, obviously, the World Wars, people from Germany and Italy. But maybe this cartoon shows it the best, because, you see these wealthy people maybe in New York City telling an immigrant they can't come in, but you can see that the shadows of these wealthy people shows that they were once immigrants too, and had to work their way up to become wealthy and successful in America. So it's just this idea that if you're an American, you don't want anyone else coming